Mr. Otway here to tell you a little bit about the battle tactics of the USA during the war in Vietnam. And these sorts of things will be able to help you with your cover work this week whilst I'm in Bewley Park. So the first thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is this idea of fragging, which is where American soldiers, the ordinary combat troops, murdered their officers. It's called fragging because of fragmentation grenades, which was, especially in the early cases, the weapon of choice for people who wanted to kill their officer but make it look like the enemy had done it. And there's various reasons that troops did this, American troops would do this. I would say the main reason that American troops would want to assassinate their officer would be if their officer was particularly, shall we say, unconventional in their methods, a little bit mean in other words, or, and perhaps in some cases, were putting their troops into places of danger, putting them in dangerous situations where they might be more likely to be killed by members of the Viet Cong. So to stop these officers who were too keen, who were too willing to put their troops in dangerous situations, when they were out on patrol, they would kill them. And there were over 230 known cases, and these are on the ones that they discovered, of American soldiers fragging their officers, which is an extraordinary number and goes to show just what some of the soldiers thought about their methods in Vietnam. Another note about fragging is what the officers used to do to draw Viet Cong out from their hiding places, so to speak, is they would purposefully send a small number of troops into an area where the Viet Cong are operating. The Viet Cong would see this, attack those troops, and then the Americans would send in reinforcements from helicopters. But for those small amounts of troops who were sent in as sort of the bait, well, that would be horrible for those troops, and this is the sort of thing which would lead to fragging. Now here you can see two American troops that would have been part of a platoon who are out looking for Viet Cong, trying to hunt down the Viet Cong who are trying to remain elusive and to kill them. And this would be called a search and destroy mission. Just as it sounds, you search for the Viet Cong, and then when the Viet Cong are located, you destroy them. Very often it would be a case of the patrol finding the Viet Cong, keeping them there, and calling in air support, maybe from aircraft coming to bomb them or from helicopters bringing reinforcements. The Viet Cong used to combat this in a couple of different ways. Of course, one of the easiest ways to avoid them being killed would be to try to escape. But another thing they would do is try to fight the Americans from close quarters. So the Americans wouldn't be able to call in an airstrike because there'd be a big risk of the airstrike landing on top of them. So they could either try and get away or try fight close to the Americans. But search and destroy missions put a great strain on the soldiers. And if you look in this picture, you can see how ready they are, how alert they are, particularly the soldier at the front. And lurking in that grass could be anything. They could be punji traps, they could be tripwires next to grenades. The Viet Cong could be 2 miles away, and both of these men in the field could be at serious risk of being killed at any second. And that put a great strain on the soldiers, and it led to things like what we spoke about previous, like incidents of fragging, because the officers that might have sent their troops on more search and destroy missions than they were willing to do, and therefore the troops took action against their officers. The strain also led to something else. And that something else that the search and destroy missions led to was drug abuse. Now this is a scene from a very famous Vietnam film called Platoon, which when I get back from Bewley I might let you see a little bit of. But the soldier in this picture from Platoon is completely high on drugs, and it was a very common occurrence because they spent so long when they were on duty under intense strain, fear, seeing their comrades blown to pieces, and very often never seeing the Viet Cong, being killed by traps, booby traps, maybe catching a glimpse of the Viet Cong, but just living under fear such long periods of time that to release the tension, many of them turned to drug abuse. And that's what you see in Platoon. And it's very well documented, and you can read a bit more about it in the books. Well, I mentioned during talking about the search and destroy missions how the Americans would locate the Viet Cong and then try to dominate them using air support. They had to try and keep the Viet Cong fighting long enough for the aircraft to arrive to bomb and kill them. But that's not the only way they used air support in bombing and in rushing in reinforcements into a battle zone. They also used air support to try to take away some of the advantages that the Viet Cong had. Now you might be aware, you should be aware by now, that the biggest advantage the Viet Cong had was that they were fighting a guerrilla war. They were fighting and running off. They were trying to inflict casualties and then escaping deep into the jungle or back into the tunnels before the Americans could respond. So, and the Americans, knowing this, decided they had to do something about it, and they had a couple of options. One of which was something called Agent Orange, which in essence is really a very toxic weed killer, which when sprayed over areas, and you can see some American aircraft spraying it here, would destroy the vegetation. Now, in official terms, the Agent Orange was used to destroy the jungle, which it did. The Americans definitely used this Agent Orange to take away areas of jungle that Viet Cong were suspected of operating in, thereby removing their cover. But you can see in this photograph they appear to be spraying it over farmland, and there's lots of reports of Americans spraying it over farmland to destroy the crops, where there might have been villages that were providing food and materials for the Viet Cong. And Agent Orange remains something very controversial today, because not only did it have an effect on the vegetation, it also had and continues to have an effect on the Vietnamese people living in the areas where the chemical is sprayed. And there's all sorts of research that's been done in areas, and we're talking in fairly recent history, in areas of Vietnam that were sprayed with Agent Orange, where children are born with deformities, which is not easy to look at, which we see here. And Americans deny that Agent Orange caused these sorts of things, but there's also been action in America to protest about the use of Agent Orange during the Vietnam War, because as you can see from the following picture, the American soldiers who fought in Vietnam, who handled Agent Orange, loading it onto the aircraft, flying the aircraft full of Agent Orange, transporting it to the airfields. Well, the US veterans are dying from the effects. You're much more likely to get cancer, for example, as a result of Agent Orange. So it did have an effect in destroying the vegetation, but think of the support that must have generated in the Viet Cong. The Vietnamese seeing their country ravaged and destroyed, and children born with deformities, would only make the Vietnamese more likely to support the Viet Cong, thus making it pretty much impossible for the Americans to win. Another reason why the Americans made things difficult for themselves in Vietnam. So the weapon that you can see here, dropped by the American bombers, is napalm, which is like a jelly that sticks, it clings and it burns at a ferocious temperature. It causes horrendous injuries, and of course it's not selective as to who it kills. If they drop the napalm on or near a village, it could end up killing innocent civilians, and again make more support for the Viet Cong, which is what the Americans don't want. And you'll see in the following photograph an example of the horrific burns that napalm can cause. But it burnt, it destroyed the jungle, and it took away some of the advantages that the Viet Cong had. Taking away the Viet Cong's fighting ability, it certainly did, but make more Vietnamese more likely to support the Viet Cong, it also did. One more thing I'm going to talk to you about is what you see here, which is a Zippo raid. It's called a Zippo raid because this lighter is a Zippo lighter, and what Americans often did is they would go on a search and destroy mission, to a Vietnamese village, if they suspected that the village was helping or hiding or even containing Viet Cong members, what they would do is they would set fire to the houses, which, as you can see, are very easily flammable. You can see a bit of a different perspective on the Zippo raids in this following picture. So there you have an American soldier carrying what looks like a rocket launcher, grenade launcher on his back, and you can see the cigarettes and the Zippo lighter in the band around his helmet, and you can see the burning Vietnamese village that he's just nonchalantly walking past. I mean, he's not even looking at it. Now consider if you're a Vietnamese villager who hadn't been helping the Viet Cong, and along comes an American who suspects that you have and burns your whole village down. What's that going to make you do? Of course, it's going to give you an incentive to join the Viet Cong or to support the Viet Cong. It's certainly not the sort of thing that's going to make you want to support the capitalists. So the Americans are doing all these things to try to take out the Viet Cong, and they probably did take out Viet Cong from doing these things. But I would say for every Viet Cong that they killed or tracked down and took prisoner or took the support away from, in doing the things that I've talked about, they probably created another 4 Viet Cong members or Viet Cong supporters as a result of the tactics that they were using. So there you have it, and this photograph finally just sort of about sums up the American tactics in the Vietnam War. They've obliterated a landscape here, a part of Vietnam. You can see what looks like American troops have moved into the area. They've perhaps used napalm to burn all the trees around. They may well have used Agent Orange to kill off the other vegetation because there doesn't appear to be much there. You can see elements of air superiority, air power, with the helicopter maybe taking supplies up to the troops, ferrying troops around very quickly. So, I hope this was useful in helping you with your notes. Bye.